Kelsey, I always like to start at the beginning. So I wanted to ask you, what were you like growing up? And what would you say was some childhood experiences which shaped you?
Man, what was I like growing up? Definitely not into tech at all. I was into playing sports. I grew up in Long Beach, California. I spent more time outside than inside. So back then, you went outside as soon as you can, playing basketball, neighborhood friends, flag football in the street, riding skateboards. You just did everything you could not to come home except for to eat and then to sleep and then repeat it all the next day. And so pretty much I learned a lot of, I guess, how to deal with humans, whether it's competitively through sports or just trying to fit in with the cool kids, because growing up in the neighborhood, there's kids of all ages that hang out together. So you kind of pick up a little nuance from the older kids and their experiences in life. And it wasn't until I got into high school that I started to kind of take a look into tech. But the things that I think shaped me the most was seeing my stepdad at the time. He had things like vending machines. And then on the weekends, we would go and refill the vending machines and take out all the coins. And we would count the coins on the living room floor and roll them into those paper things, $10, $5 nominations, and then take them to the bank. And in many ways, I don't think I was paying attention to the entrepreneurial side of all of that, but it definitely stuck with me that you can actually be more than a consumer. You can also create things, you can create business opportunities. And so it's just little micro lessons like that throughout my career that kind of kept me a bit well rounded. But I also lived not too far from like streets you just wouldn't even ride your bike down, where the police would come. And it was a gentle reminder that the world isn't a safe place. And it doesn't mean that you can't go outside. It's just that means you need to be aware of what the boundaries are. And there are people who have their own driving forces that may not align with yours. And so you learn a little bit of street smarts. You learn that the real world can be great, wonderful, and inspiring, but also it could be a very dangerous place. And so that balance has always kept me to be this kind of hopeful, pessimistic. So when I see new technologies come out, I'm never just like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever and screaming it from the rooftops. I always look for balance and I try to see both sides of the coin.
That's really interesting. I always ask people this question about childhood because I think it does really shape you. And it's interesting what you're saying there about the vending machines, because I don't know if you know Ryan Hoover, who started Product Hunt. He had a very similar experience and it taught him a lot about entrepreneurship as well. In that exact scenario, his father had a place with vending machines. So you went from California, I think, to Atlanta. You said you weren't really into tech until at school you got to try it. How old were you when you got on your first computer and what was the experience like?
I mean, I think I was definitely in elementary and middle school when I got on my first computer. I think maybe my very first experience was playing like Oregon Trail during one of the school sessions where kids would line up and go get a little bit of computer time. But I never thought about it as anything more than a toy, something you play with. I never thought about it as a tool. I probably thought a calculator was more useful at that time. And so this is around, I was born in 81. So I probably touched my first computer in the 90s, but definitely not thinking that it was more than something you just used during school or to play with. At some point, my dad got one for the house. But again, it was just more like clicking around. I wasn't one of these people who were programming at an early age, not at all. I might have clicked on it. This calculator is cool, but I never was really into it. I'd rather play Nintendo or actually just go out and play basketball or do something like that. Going to high school, that move from Long Beach, California to Atlanta, Georgia, I missed half a school year. Life's complicated like that sometimes. And to get, in order to make up some of those credits, I joined this technology student association program. There were two parts. One part was, a normal class during the day. You have home ec, you have auto shop. I chose the one that had the most computer stuff involved. And I thought it would be just something interesting because I knew nothing about it. And they also had an after school program for kids that really wanted to pursue like regional competitions and things like AutoCAD. So part of the curriculum would be, of course, you learn how to program. Back then, a lot of us were learning TI Basic, right? The programming language for your fancy calculator. You can make little games with it. And I was like, all right, this is cool. But for some reason, I was drawn to things like AutoCAD. And the AutoCAD world was like, hey, you need to draw these sketches or these diagrams, and you have to do them to spec. You have to think about the materials and the cost. And at the regional level, you would go compete with people in the state. They would give you an assignment, and you would compete to see who could actually do the blueprint, follow the specification, and print it out. And for me, that kind of filled that void that I had when I was playing sports, where there is a competition. There are levels to this. You can acquire new skills, and you can actually use them not only to compete, but I think in that moment around 10th grade, I kind of realized that maybe this is a set of skills I should pay attention to. And so it was on my radar.
It's quite astute of you as a child to realize that these were kind of skills that would be useful to you. You obviously did pretty well when you were doing these competitions, and it led to obviously a long and very good career in tech. I wanted to ask you, what was your first job in tech? So you did these competitions as a youngster. I know I think you attended university, but stopped and left and basically got self-taught. Can you tell us about that and why you left university and why you went down this path, which was obviously something that proved to be very helpful and fortuitous?
To be clear, there was no straight line from 10th grade to where I am now at all. That was
Yes.
just to graduate on time. My mom, single mother, 2 kids, she works all the time, and she doesn't make enough money to necessarily spend a bunch of time with us. And, we did okay. We weren't in the depths of poverty, but I could understand being able to go get a job at McDonald's at 15 years old and using some of that money just to contribute $20 to the light bill goes a long way, to the point where you get to buy your own school clothes, and that starts to help out a little bit. And so for me, I knew that there was a void, there was a gap. And so for me, the early job was anything that legally made money. So that could be pushing a lawnmower around the neighborhood and trying to get a little money by cutting people's grass. After school, 5 p.m., you need to be at McDonald's on time because the shift starts at 6. And sometimes that means walking a mile and a half. And working at that McDonald's, remember, this is a high-paced environment. The pay is definitely low, but it's a high-paced environment. And the structure for getting things done, the process is so simplified that anyone can actually do it, right? They can almost hire anyone from the street with very little training. Within a couple of days, they can get that person to be productive on the grill, on drive-through, the whole nine. And so when I was there, you're this ambitious 15-year-old, and you're just happy that you have the opportunity to make any money. You're doing the math, right? $5 an hour is probably less than that during that time. If I multiply it by 40, then I can make a couple $100 after taxes. And for me, a couple $100 every week, that was a big deal because that means I could go fill in the gaps and maybe buy the things I wanted and take a bit of pressure off of my mom trying to do all of this by herself. And so I learned a lot of maturity growing up. That store manager who made sure that I approached things with a level of professionalism. Like, hey, if you're going to go sweep the lobby, you got to make sure that it's actually clean. Don't be in a rush. Don't leave trash on the floor. Have some respect. And so I think McDonald's kind of sets a tone for me as a professional, making sure that I understood empathy for customers. Even though they were paying like $1 for some pancakes, they still paid $1 for their pancakes, and they had expectations. So if they were cold, that was a problem, and I had the authority to fix it. And so I think working fast food jobs gives you a level of appreciation for what work is and how you can work really, really hard and not make a lot of money. So lots of people say work harder, not smarter, but that doesn't matter if you don't have any opportunities. And so graduating high school, yes, I went to college because it was essentially paid for. In Georgia at that time, and I think it's still true today, if you have a B average, they have something called the Hope Scholarship, and your tuition is essentially paid for. You may have to pay a couple $100 for books. You can live at home or stay on a nearby apartment. Maybe you have to cover some of those costs. But for the most part, there was a lot of opportunity for someone that just wanted to go to college. And so I remember going to Clayton State University. It was a college not too far from home. But at that time, it was like when you turn 18, you need to leave the house. So I left the house. But you got to remember, I had been working for 3 or 4 years by that point. I saved enough money to buy my own car from Auto Trader. It was like $1,000 little Jeep Cherokee. And I also learned how to become a mechanic, because when you don't have a lot of money, you learn to change your own oil. When you don't have a lot of money and the engine goes out, you learn how to take it out of the truck and drive it to get repaired just to save that extra $400. And so at that point, I think I understood that there is a way to make things happen if you're willing to learn, because I went to the auto parts store and bought a manual to learn how to take that engine out of my truck and put it back in. And so when I was in college, I looked at the curriculum and look, maybe if I would have been a bit more patient, I would have got to the good stuff, right? The first 2 years is kind of boilerplate for a lot of people, but I just didn't have the patience for that. And so I just stopped going. And I decided that there has to be a better way. And that's when I headed towards IT certifications, A+ certification. Go to the bookstore, $35. And at that time, I'm looking at all of these jobs and what the requirements were. And then you see things like A+ certification. And I was like, you know what? If this is what the people are doing in the professional world, let me start there. And if you look at some of the starting salaries, they were a lot more than I was making. So for me, I was just going to be happy going from fast food to anything related to technology. Number one, it didn't require college. Number two, these certifications felt like a guided path into a respectable field. And so I put all of my eggs in that basket. And I think that's the thing that creates that chain reaction. So all of the maturity to that point where you realize that how you succeed in life, you have some control. You don't have all the control, but you do have some control. And getting that A+ certification is the thing that kind of kicked over the domino.
What's fascinating, though, is that at such a young age, you were resourcefulness, which I think obviously came from necessity, but also that you were making these mental notes of what it took to succeed, and you chose this path. Did you have much of a plan so you got these certifications, and I think you started out at BellSouth, if I'm right, if that's the first company you started working for. Did you have a long-term plan? Were you the sort of person that thought, right, this is what I'm going to do for this amount of time, and then I'm going to go work somewhere else? Or did you just end up in the job and then see where it took you?
Yeah, I think at that age, I didn't really have a plan, because in order to have a plan, you have to kind of know what's possible.
Mm.
And so there's no way I've known what was possible. All I knew was if you get a certification, you at least have one of the qualifications for one of these jobs. And so the plan was to study, go past the exam, and get the certification in hand, and then apply and see what happens from there. And after my second certification, I think it was Network Plus, within the same kind of scope of education. BellSouth at that time, we're talking 2000, 2001 maybe. This is when high-speed internet access was starting to roll out. We were moving from dial-up, where you plug a phone line into the back of your computer and you have to make that decision. Do you talk on the phone or do you surf the internet? Most people can't do both at that time. And so high-speed internet was coming out. Not only would it be faster, but it will remove that limitation. And there was pretty much a 3 to 9 month waiting list for some people, because they didn't have enough people to drive around, let alone the infrastructure in place to support it all. There was another factor at play here, which was all the people who had decades of experience running phone lines to your house. They didn't really have experience with networking or computers. That was a little bit out of scope. And maybe they were unionized too, where they said, hey, that's not on us, right? We are telephone technicians. That's what we do. This internet thing is a whole new thing. Number one, we're just going to need time to ramp up. And so what they did was hire contractors. And the contractors would then fill in the gaps for these technicians. Now, the technicians drive the fancy BellSouth trucks with the ladders and all the fancy equipment. The contractors, you drive your own car and you get your own tool bag, and then they just give you a list of addresses that you need to go and a window that was scheduled. And so they had this recruiting fair. If you had your A+ and Network Plus, then they will give you a chance to be a contractor. And what that resulted in is you would go on a few calls, and the person you were paired with would try to figure out, does this person has what it takes to actually go do this on their own? And for me, the answer was yes. And it was pretty good money, because if you went to someone's house at that time to like fix something that was broken, like they had a previous install, but some reason their internet wasn't online, it could have been a web browser configuration. You made like $75. You drove there, you fixed it, and you're out. And if it was a brand new install, then you made like $100 to $150. And so for someone like me with this kind of hustler's mentality, then I'm starting to do the math. And it's like, wow, this is pretty good money. And again, I have a bit more control on the outcome. And I would do that for a number of years until I realized that, listen, you go do these jobs for $150. How much is the contractor making? Also, the customer would say, hey, it's a small insurance company. You pull up, and our mandate was to install the internet on one computer and then leave. But there were 10 computers in some of those buildings. And the owners would say, hey, how do I get internet on all of the computers, not just this one? And you were like, well, you're going to need a switch. You're going to need a router. You're also going to have to run cables to these other computers. There's a lot that goes into it. But that wasn't the job. And boy, did I see the opportunity. And so immediately afterwards, I just started my own company that was going in not only to do those contract jobs, but would also come in and be these companies' mini IT departments. And I opened a store not too far from where I lived, just a computer shop where I could keep a few spare parts and sometimes help people in the local community get computer repair services. But it was really home base for the contractor work, and brought over a few friends from the contracting gig. And we just kind of did the same thing, but on our own terms.
I love that you went off and did this on your own. And I think there's a theme in your whole career about community, because I've heard you talk about this particular place before and how it became like a community, like people could just drop in. I think you even had, was it some kind of recording, like music studio, like equipment there as well, so people could come in and you could DJ, and it just sounded like an amazing way of getting custom by being authentic and kind of connecting with the community. So you were doing that for a few years, but I've heard you say on another podcast that you also ended up, it was a bit of a left field thing to do, but you ended up managing a comedian, someone who you went to school with. Can you just tell me a little bit about that and kind of what lessons you took from that to what you ended up doing, and kind of like the entrepreneurial spirit of yourself?
Yeah, so at that time, being 19 or 20 years old, with this little computer store, and remember, a lot of people hear small business owner and they think, wow, this person has a lot of money. No, I slept in my car behind that computer shop some nights because there was either $1,000 to rent the space or $1,000 for rent. I chose to rent the space, and you could revisit mom and take a shower here and there. I had friends that I could go visit, and so I kind of made that trade-off early on. And again, at that point, you're kind of in like this hustler's mentality. You're sitting there saying, how do I drum up more business? Because you're kind of responsible for yourself and the other people who have agreed to kind of partner with you in the business doing some of these service calls. And I remember I got a call, and there's a music studio. I don't know anything about music studios. I don't know anything about mixing and mastering records, none of that. I listen to music, but that's as far as my expertise went. And I remember getting this call, and it wasn't the nicest neighborhood ever. And I'm sitting there like, I am going to get robbed. They're going to rob the computer guy, guaranteed. Look at me with my tool bag and collar shirt. I ain't leaving in one piece. And I walk into the studio, and there's all these posters of local rap artists on the wall. There's these large mixing boards, these physical components that people used to make music at that time. And now we were in this transition from analog to digital. And I remember the producer was asking me, he's like, listen, I want to go from this mixing board stuff to, he had this software, Cool Edit Pro. Lots of producers were using tools like Pro Tools at the time, but basically they were getting virtual instruments, virtual representations of all the stuff that they had invested 10, 20 years in was all going digital. And the nice thing about that process was they could record the music and burn a CD for the artist on the way out the door. And so there was like this all in one. But the problem was most of them had no experience with computers and no one else did. And so at that time, I was like, you know what? Your editing program is crashing because you don't have enough RAM. Look at the error. He's like, I don't know, man. I hit record, and when we add more tracks, the computer crashes. So I was like, listen, let's put more memory in it and see what happens. And it turns out it fixes the problem. And at this point, I am the computer guy. for all the music artists or producers in Atlanta. And so now that I'm doing this thing, I decided to set up a small studio inside of the shop. So if you came in, you would see this nice layout. I even converted the bathroom to a speaker booth with a window in it so you can see like the whole setup and visualize what this would look like in your own studio. So now word's getting around town. It's like, hey, the person we went to high school with, he has a computer shop there. So I would see like friends' moms come in to get their computer fixed or buy a new keyboard. And one day, one of my friends from high school, 1 year older than me, Ronnie Jordan, shows up. He's like, hey, Kelsey, man, I heard you out here doing all this business. You seem to be business acclimated. So I'm a comedian. And I'm looking at him like, I don't recall you ever being like that funny to be a comedian. And he was like, well, I need a manager. And I'm, again, doing the math. How much does managers typically make? Well, it depends on what they do. It could be from 10 to 30%. I'm like, those are good margins. How much do you make as a comedian? He was like, well, it's early. And most of these clubs pay a grand total of like $25. 10% of $25, that's like $2.50. That's not going to even cover the gas to get there. And so, but I agreed. First, let's find out if you're funny. And then he's like, another thing, I'm going to need a ride to the show. I was like, okay. And he had 2 shows in one night. And so we go to the first show. And the first show is a predominantly Black audience and the club, Uptown Comedy Quarter. Listen, you get 10 seconds to prove you're funny or you're being booed off stage. This ain't Comedy Central. 10 seconds, you better come with your best joke, and the crowd will give you the ability to tell the next joke. And he held his own. I was like, wow, if you're funny here, you have a chance. And I was like, where's the next show? And it's on the north side of town, predominantly white neighborhood. And you can't say those words nor those jokes the same way you said in that club and the other one. I got to see how this is going to go. And like clockwork, he was able to pivot and get the same laughs with the same premises, and he switched it up for both of the audiences. And I was like, let's try it. And that led to lots of things that I've written about in the past, but over time, I'm still running the computer business. I'm still growing in those worlds, but I'm also growing in understanding the entertainment business and how entertainers actually work. And I think that had a lot of impact on my own public speaking career, knowing that these shows are not just there to educate and inform, but you're also there to entertain.
That's really interesting, because that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because you are such a fantastic storyteller. And whenever people talk about you, they often say how wonderful you are at doing your talks, but also obviously back in the day, doing your live demos. So I was curious about what you learned from that. Do you feel like, were you always confident? Because when you were going to tech conferences and doing demos and stuff, I mean, sometimes it might be, a few people, few hundred, few thousand, and then it was going into the tens of thousands. Like, how much confidence does one need to get up in front of that type of crowd?
In many ways, I think confidence is taken away from people. When you're born, when you're around your friends and your family, you know how to talk to them in very natural ways. When you're around people that make you feel good, it inspires you to tell your own stories, right? Like some people's like, I got a ticket on the way over here, and they tell this magnificent story that makes their friends laugh. So I think a lot of us have this stuff by default. The thing is, though, in a professional setting, not everyone possesses those skills, or they've been trained to remove it. Leave your personality at the door. We want you to wear the exact same clothes as everyone else. We want you to talk like everyone else. This is professional, and that's it. Suits and to sound like a college professor, end of story. And it robs us of our identities. It robs us of our personalities. And what happens is everyone starts talking and doing the same thing. And of course you're nervous because it's unnatural. You have to pretend to talk that way. Who talks that way? Who actually uses PowerPoints to talk to other humans? Nobody. Right? That's something you've been taught. And so early on, a lot of people adopt that style. And it's unnatural and it's unpleasant pretty much for everybody watching and the person on stage. And at some point, I decided to ditch the slides and actually make sure I knew what I was doing hands-on, undeniably hands-on. And so the live demos, since I wrote the demo, I spent all of my career in various capacities, writing code, troubleshooting, debugging, building business. It doesn't matter. So at that point, it's almost like a professional athlete. Of course, they can perform in front of a crowd of 60,000 because their movements are just at that point second nature. So they can perform at the highest levels. And I treated my skill set in tech like professional athletes treat their abilities, making sure that you can actually touch type, making sure you know the depths of your programming language, making sure that if you say that you know how to use a particular technology, you have to know that thing inside and out. So if something were to go wrong on stage, it's kind of like a jazz musician, right? They can go and do something off script and then jump right back on beat because they're really good and they're professional musicians. And I think for me, I had that level of confidence and it felt better. So when I was doing my live demos, instead of them being 100% scripted out or pre-recorded, I would almost do it like a artist performing on stage. You look at the crowd, you make eye contact, you tell a natural joke as it comes to you. You learn patience, you learn to wait, and you know the demo is going to be good. So you kind of draw it out and you keep people on the edge of their seats. You educate and you entertain. And I think people then not only learn something, but they remember it, and then it inspires them to go want to do the same.
I totally agree. I think that being able to connect with an audience is one way to help them remember what you've said and why you've said it and the importance of what you're doing. The thing is, most technical people that I've met are not highly skilled in entertaining as well. And a lot of the kind of very technical people find demos extremely painful. Obviously, you've made a career out of doing it, so your skills were absolutely honed. But I wanted to ask, because I think you talked about it on a podcast, but I also watched this video where you did a demo, but you also, it was 2017 and you got up on stage and you actually said, I'm going to just tell you a bit of my story. And I thought, I've never seen anyone do that before in that kind of setting. How important is it, do you think, for you personally in your career to be connecting with an audience like that?
So there's two pieces to this. One was the live demos for someone that looks like me. I had to constantly keep proving that I belonged on the stage. A lot of people are like, hey, anyone that can talk or dress decent can't be a hardcore tech person. No way. You're supposed to be in the basement. You're supposed to be programming at the age of 4 somehow. And then you are a tech person. And so whenever someone like me shows up, people in the audience are like, wait a minute, like, what does he know about any of this stuff? And some of this stuff is on the cutting edge. This wasn't like tried and true technology. Some of this stuff was just coming out and people were hearing about this stuff for the first time. And does he really write code? Does he really contribute? Did someone make this demo for him? Did someone, when you see an artist, like, did someone else write the song and you're just the person singing the song? And so a lot of people may have that in the back of their mind. So when that live demo comes, it is undeniable. You are who you are. There's nothing they can do to challenge that. Someone would ask me a question and I say, hold on, let me show you the answer. Let's dig under the covers of all of this. Do you see this bit of code here? This is how it works. Now, you may want to go back and write it, but maybe you should do it this way. And then you do it live. And at that point, your credibility goes up. And so for a long time, those live demos were just a way to make sure no one was confused about my skill or capabilities, and also that they would no longer prejudge anyone that looked like me at all and maybe consider them not having those skills. So that was the reason for the live demos. I brought that in almost as a crutch in many ways to make sure that I could actually get to the point where people can actually hear me and listen to me and not judge me. But all speakers must grow. And so at some point, it takes a lot of work to create these live demos. What a lot of people don't realize is that you're not just doing something that's easy. A lot of times you're creating something from scratch. A lot of my demos were prototypes on how the world should exist, not how it exists today. And so some people, even experienced engineers who have been in the field for a long time, will watch the demo and say, I've never seen something like that before. What is that? I was like, it doesn't exist. It's a prototype. I made it real so I could show you. And then they would be inspired to maybe make a better version or go tell someone else about the idea. But again, I had to make progress. And I said, you know what? I started adding story elements to those live demos. And it gave them these bookends that took people on an emotional roller coaster, in addition to giving them that technical substance that they came for. But one day I said, what if I just left the computer at home? could I actually hold the audience without the live demo? And I'm nervous because here's the thing, I don't write speaker notes. I don't plan to talk out 100% before I get there. You're just in the shower, you're on those drives, you're watching TV, and in the back of your head, you're kind of seeing yourself on stage. What would I say? And sometimes you'll say something and you may take a note of it, and you kind of have this high level structure. But again, it's like jazz. So you get on the stage and you look at the audience. And I remember that particular keynote that you're referring to, I don't have any slides. I don't have a computer. I'm feeling naked on that stage because the things most people want to see from me, they're not going to see this time. It's like the artist's third album, the one where they try something new and not the thing that's going to land on the top of the charts. And so I remember coming on that stage and the rehearsal, they wanted me to do a run through. I was like, I don't have any slides nor a computer, but here's my walk-on music. And during the rehearsal, and this is an event where I've spoken a few times, and there's a big AV team. There's probably 18 to 20,000 people in the audience. And I said, listen, when my go-on music plays, I would like you to lower it to about half volume, a little lower, and let me continue to talk. And I remember coming on that stage with my music, and they lowered it just perfectly. And I kept on talking in my intro. And I said something about giving my first tech presentation for this particular technology. And it was going really smooth. I ran this command and it worked. Everyone in the audience is looking at this live demo like, oh my God, we're seeing this all for the first time. And then it broke. And I said to the audience, you could literally hear the music stop. And they cut the music. And it was just dead silent. Oh. And everyone felt like they had been transported to that moment where my demo broke. And there were people in that audience that were also at that original thing 7 years prior. And I think those people remember that moment. And I would look over to them and I actually mentioned their names. You look to your left, there's Joe Beta sitting there in the audience. You look to your right and you see Brian Grant. And they're all watching to like, is he going to recover? And I did recover and I made it work. And that's what this community was all about. And I went on to tell 2 more stories, and they were all kind of this recap of my career to that point. And I think a lot of people saw a new version of Kelsey, right? They know me as the technical person. They know me as this person who's very hands-on, is going to try the most dangerous live demos with no backup plan. But then this time I removed the safety net and I just gave them the human side for the first time. And ever since that talk that you saw, I don't think I did any more live demos.
That's really interesting. Also, I've heard you say before that kind of one of the things that you were, I think, asked to do was to get on Twitter. But when you started doing your live demos, someone said, look, if you're going out to conferences, you should be on Twitter because people want to ask you questions. And I feel like I have been following you for a few years now, and I feel like I have learned so much because I'm not technical, as I said, before we started recording. But I really enjoy following you. And I think that I've learned so much from you because of your Twitter. And I think obviously you host many spaces and you have for a while now, which gives back to the community so much. And when I put a question out the other day about how I was interviewing you and what did anyone want to ask you, one of the questions that came up, which I think is a good one, is what drives you? Because you give so much back. So you've worked in open source. You obviously went to Google, which we haven't touched on yet, but you have given so much of your time outside of these companies. What is it? What is it that drives you?
I think most people that go through life, there's a progression. And it feels really good when you're at the point in your life where you have way more than you need. It could be knowledge, it could be money, it could be anything. But when you get to a point where you have more than you need, it is easy, or it should be easy, to give some of it away. And so the driving motivation for me is I have way more than I need. That's been true for a long time. And in many ways, from those early speaking engagements to my interactions on social media, in many ways, the community has given me permission just to be who I was. So when I stopped the PowerPoints, when I stopped the speaker notes, and you just got me in my purest form, that part's sustainable. And so being able to do this without the mask, without the superhero outfit, just who I am, again, that lowers the barrier of entry to do these things. So when people reach out to me, they're typically asking me questions based on what they've seen. So it's very easy for me just in that moment to just carve out some time. And here's the thing, look, I think when you're coming up, you wish people just treat you with respect regardless. If I'm not sitting in first class, I would still like to be treated as a customer. I think that is a natural thing. And so for me, just reminding myself, and sometimes you got to remind yourself, be humble. There was a time where people didn't know your name at all. There was a time you were hoping someone would reach out to you for a job opportunity. And you got to stay humble, because to me, all the people who support me now, whether they follow me on social media, they come up to you at a conference just to take your picture, those people tend to say nice things about you when you are not around. And I have a strong belief that is your reputation and your legacy. Forget if it's 1 million people, even if it's 10 people, and those people interact with you and they walk away feeling that way, that has always been the goal. And look, some of this, if you're just being very honest and transparent, all of us have an ego. We satisfy it through different means. And so for me, my ego is aligned around self-improvement. And this community interaction is a feedback loop for myself. I get to test ideas about my views of the world. Sometimes they're wrapped in fact. A lot of times they're wrapped in opinion based on fact and experience combined together. And when I put it out there, then the community gives me feedback on, do those analogies work? Is that a right way of seeing the world? And guess what? The people who know a bit more than me in a particular topic, they tend to give me time to help me close my own knowledge gap. So I kind of find this loop of learning in public, making myself available. And I think people see me do that, and they do the same for me in return. And honestly, it's just too easy to do that, right? I could be mean, I could be angry, I could walk around being a prima donna or treating people and behaving like an asshole. You could do that, but I think it takes the same amount of energy just to like be kind, be nice, make time for others, and see if you can just nudge someone else in the right direction. And look, the last thing I'll say around this is some people believe in all kinds of things. Some people believe in karma. Some people believe in lots of things. But the one thing that I think that people don't exercise enough, every person has a bit of power regarding the situation around them. If you think about it, you're driving down the highway, 60, 70 miles per hour. You could literally move your car into the wrong lane, and in a split second, you can cause a major crash on the highway and people can get hurt. And that's kind of power you have. So you have to drive responsibly. No distracted driving, you wear your seatbelt, and you try to pay attention because that's your responsibility. But if you take the same outlook on like regular life, when you go to the coffee shop and you take the time to smile, if you go to that coffee shop regularly, maybe you get to learn the person's name and you can greet them by their name, just the way they try to greet you by your name. And it could just be that very day that they were having a terrible day and they look forward when you come in. Or maybe one day you're feeling super generous. Maybe you won the lottery and you go back to your favorite coffee shop and you give that person $1,000. And it turns out this person is $948.32 short on their rent. And this $1,000 makes the difference between them thinking that everything is going to be okay and things actually being okay. And that's the power I think you hold as an individual. So for me, even though you can't necessarily always help people en masse, I try not to miss those opportunities to just help person, even if it's just one-on-one.
Kelsey, you are such a good human. I'm sure you you know this already, but I've seen when I was doing my research, there were little things that I noticed. Like there was a video clip of you at a conference where it was off stage, and you'd obviously been invited to do like a one-on-one talk, and it was at a booth, and someone started to interview you. But before you answered the first question, you said, "Hold on a minute, I just want to apologize." And basically, there was a crowd in front of you, and you were apologizing because you said that you'd turned up late. And I'm sure it was probably not that late at all, but you'd been somewhere else, you'd done a talk, and that there was a crowd there that wanted to ask you questions, and you said that you wanted to give them your time and you were apologizing for that. And obviously you wouldn't have even known that someone was filming this. So I just thought there's so much about you, like all the lessons that you're even talking about today are such important lessons for so many of us. So I appreciate that. I want to talk about Google because obviously it's been such a major part of your career. I mean, there's so much to talk about. You're a distinguished engineer and obviously developer advocate at Google Cloud. You're a key engineer behind the Kubernetes project. What would you say is your kind of proudest moment in your career? Because getting a job in Google, I'm guessing when I asked you earlier, like, where did you think your career was going to go? I'm guessing Google might not have been on the radar. What did it mean to you to work at Google? And what would you say is your proudest moment?
I'll be honest, by that time, it didn't mean as much as most people think it should mean.
Mm.
By that time, 7 years ago, 2015, I had already made a name for myself, and I was never going to let anyone tell me anything different. I was already a contributor to many open source projects. I had an open source project of my own. I was choosing what jobs that I wanted to work. I was at that part where one of the things about being successful is you get to choose what you work on and who you work with. And so the previous 2 or 3 roles that I had, that was the case. And so getting to Google wasn't even something I wanted to do. I was already working with the Google engineers. That was the goal, which is to work with in the realm of my peers. That's it. Not necessarily take a job with them. And so when I left the startup called CoreOS before joining Google, I decided to take a job at NASA. And so I wanted to actually work on something. Again, I'm in the evolution stage. I'm trying to evolve as a person. And so I wanted to work on things that had a bigger scope and impact on society and not just computers and open source. And so I had spent time with the NASA team teaching people there Kubernetes, a lot of open source. They were watching my videos. I would come on site, do some hands-on workshops with the team members, not necessarily to sell them anything, but literally just seeing them as a part of my community. In many ways, I was kind of thanking them for their service, right? This is a group of people working on projects like the Mars rover, launching things into space. It's like this really cool thing that I get to spend time. I've been there on site, JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs in Pasadena, California. And they would show me the Mars rover before they sent it into space. And it's like, wow, you all are really using technology to work on a very high purpose. And I was like, I want to be part of this. And so I went through the interview process, got a job offer, and my family was preparing to move to Pasadena, California. That was it. That was the game plan. And so the Google team reached out, and I was like, listen, I do not want to be employee number 172,000. That is not appealing to me. And also, a lot of the big companies tend to have a tendency, not all the time, but sometimes they'll take people who are pretty public facing, they're out there, and they bring them in and they put them in a box. Only work on the things we want you to work on. Only say the things we want you to say. And that's it. This is Google. We're bigger than you. And that may be true, but I was not a willing participant in like erasing my entire identity that I built in an authentic manner to trade it for a Google badge. Just didn't make any sense at that point in my career. I definitely think it would have been a better financial move to go to Google, no doubt. But I was beyond that part of my life. I wasn't trying to buy a yacht. I was pretty set and on my path to retirement. Maybe instead of doing it at 42, it would have been 55. But I was comfortable with that pace at the time. So after a couple of no's, I declined my offer at least 2 or 3 times and said, no, I'll just go to NASA. Yes, I get the number is higher. But eventually everyone has a price. And so we got to a point where we agreed that I can always work from home under any scenario. And this is pre-pandemic. Always work from home. It was a generous salary, lots of stock and equity. And it got to a point where, you know what? I should try it just for the speed up of my ability to retire, because at that point, my goal wasn't to find a better job. My goal was to not need one. And so I reached out to the NASA team and said, listen, as much as I want to be at NASA financially, this is just the smart move. And the NASA folks were really nice. I remember meeting the CTO, the one from the TED Talk, that talked about how humans would have to find another planet at some point, even if it's a long time from now, but no better time to start than now. And he said, listen, you can always come back. Our missions take decades to complete. So you can go to Google. If you don't like it, the team will be right here working on this stuff still. So you can just come back. So with that in my mind, I took that offer. And I've never done developer relations before, but it was the most flexible team that I could join. If you join Google as an engineer, then you're probably gonna be writing code a lot, and you won't be able to exercise all of the skills that I had amassed over the years. And I didn't want to be put in that particular box. And so DevRel it was. In many ways, I don't think I've ever done developer relations as people talk about it today. I still did my prototypes. I still contributed to open source projects. I still played the role of the PM in some situations, the role I had at the previous startup before joining Google. And so I decided that given this flexibility, and that was the promise they made, we will not put you in the box. We'll give you the ability to grow and do all the things. And it was true. For my entire time at Google, that's what happened. They gave me runway to try new things, to communicate in public, and still create my own opportunities. And so that's how I ended up at Google. But here's the thing. I've never put Google on my LinkedIn. I don't have a LinkedIn. I've never put Google on my bio because I found it unnecessary. What I wanted people to understand is that Kelsey just happens to be at Google at this point in time. And I have this phrase I say, different company, same team. Because at the end of the day, I've noticed that all of us switch jobs. Sometimes we work at competitors, sometimes we work at the same company. And I knew how dangerous it was to link your identity to your temporary job role. And so I was always guarded to make sure that I didn't give away my authenticity just because I was at Google. So my relationship at Google was a very pleasant one, but I was never willing to put Google, the brand, over me, the person.
I really like that because so many engineers or people that go and work for Google or companies like that, it really does become their identity because for them, it is the most important thing in their life. And you really do give your life to them, the amount of hours that you do and everything. You're, I guess, I won't use the word lucky because I think you've worked extremely hard for it, but you have a good setting in life. Like people know who you are and what you stand for. And I think that's really important. There was a quote that I wanted to, well, there's a couple of quotes that I want to quickly go through, but one was obviously when you decided to retire from Google, you said, as I turn the page on this chapter, I realized I've spent the last 25 years learning how to work. I hope to spend the rest of my life learning how to live. And I wanted to ask you, what does that look like to you?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like getting that first IT job. You don't know because you have no experience. I don't have any experience in retirement, so I don't know. And a lot of people that I do know that are retired, they're retired at a much later age where their body won't allow them to do all the things that they want to do. And so my early retirement, I don't know a lot of people who are in that scenario. So I don't have a great answer, but I do know it's going to require as much intentionality as I put into my tech career. And so the reason why I wanted to retire was, someone said to me, it's like, when you really get good at this stuff, you're going to have to learn to leave money on the table. So when you start your work life, no matter if it's in tech or in fast food, your goal is to survive and make money so you can put food on the table. You never think you're going to get to a point where you are still able, people are willing to pay you, and you have to look at both of those scenarios and say, you can keep it. And it took a lot of mental back and forth for years. How could you leave this much money on the table? You could do all these things with the money, right? Like if not for you, just give it to someone else. And so there's so many reasons why you can just keep working forever. You'll never have all the money in the world, but most people won't stop trying. And then I had to adjust my relationship with money. No matter how much you have, you always feel like something bad's going to happen and you won't have enough to pay for it. I'm telling you, at any ladder of the money game, you will always feel that way forever. It just doesn't go away. And so I had to change my thought process and said, listen, if I could buy anything in the world, what would it be? And for me, I would buy my time back. And I wanted to approach that discussion with myself the same way a company would approach the salary negotiation with me. You go from applying for jobs to people trying to hire you. Who are you? We just want you here and we'll find the right role. And so I'm asking, what are they paying for? Because now they're paying above and beyond the salary band. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they believe that you can actually make an impact in a way that someone that they hire just to fill the role cannot. And so I really try to dig into what that value was and what that value means, even when you leave the context of a company who would like to manage your time and direct that energy towards the things that they care about. And so I said, what if I would pay for it and buy it back? That means I would have to figure out what to do with all of that. And some of it may mean just watching Netflix, spending time with my 16-year-old daughter, or it turns out that you can do startup advisory work and get equity from lots of companies. It turns out that the keynote stages actually pay people to do speaking, especially if you've built up a brand over a couple of decades and you have authenticity and real experience that audience members find valuable. And so I walked away and I left money on the table and I still felt good about it. And that's how I know that I made progress as a person, because my whole life, I really thought the name of the game was work until you die. And I've met a lot of executives who put it all in. And I think there's one story that really just kind of helped me just reset everything. A lot of people really think living to 80 or to 100 is some kind of guarantee. It is not a guarantee at all. You don't control that part. You may get to influence it. At least that's what we tell ourselves. But you do not get to control that part. And so you don't know. So how do you behave? I think a lot of people spring into action if the doctor tells them you have 3 weeks to live. If you had 3 weeks to live, you should quit your job immediately. There is no reason why you should spend the last 3 weeks of your life commuting to work and asking people what to work on. It ain't happening unless you're working on some noble cause that only you can do. But more than likely, if the average person, you should quit your job immediately and figure out how to make the most out of the last 3 weeks. The truth is, some people actually do have only 3 weeks. Some people have 30 more years. And I remember this executive told me, Kelsey, I built this business working 14, 16 hours a day in, day out. I'm the founder, I'm the CEO. And he had 2 children, and he spent very little time with them. The business came first. And in his mind, they're young. When they get older, I'll not work as hard, especially when they can kind of observe the world a little better. The truth is, kids observe the world immediately, not just when they're like 8 or 9. That's a little too late to try to build a relationship with them. But either way, and he told me this thing where one of his sons died before he could make the pivot. So you got this plan. I got years before I had to reduce my workload and spend more time with my family. This is the right trade-off. And then this happens. And you can't reverse it. You can't fix it. And if you got to do it all over again, I'm pretty sure we'd do it differently. And so for me, I said, hey, if I buy my time back, then I'm responsible for what happens after that. And so that was just kind of the big force there. I just had to stop saying I have all the time in the world and just make sure that I was not just thinking too much in the future, but also willing to be present.
That is such a wonderful lesson to learn. And I think you're blessed that you learned it in time to be able to spend time with family and friends. Because I know so many people, especially founders, who've gone on this path and they just want to make as much money as possible. And they think, or they convince themselves they're doing it for the family. And then they realize at some point that actually they missed out on all that time and it wasn't necessarily worth it. A couple more things I just want to ask you. So there was one quote that I also really enjoyed from you, which was, hope allows us to consider what's possible and try things without the guarantee of success. Hope gives us confidence when the numbers don't. Hope is an acceptable business strategy because it has worked before. And most business strategies are nothing more than structured hope, which I thought was fantastic. I wanted to ask you, because I think you actually give people a lot of hope. And I wondered, how do you cultivate hope in a world which can sometimes feel extremely bleak?
Uh-oh, you're digging into the philosophical side.
Well, that
In
is
in
so much about you, right? As in, not everyone gets to see it, but I think if you follow you for long enough, you see that side of you.
I think in tech, one thing I learned is that the fundamentals, right? Some people look at a computer chip from Intel and they see this mystery. And then the people who work at Intel on chip design, they know it comes from sand. We turn sand into silicon to make processors for phones and laptops. And so they can see the world very simply because they know how it works. And so I always kind of push myself to say, man, do you really understand it? Can you break it down simply? And so the things I do, and I don't have the perfect answer, but in order to give myself hope, I try to step back and zoom out. And I think I was remember watching Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was explaining how the universe works. And he was talking about galaxies. Like there's lots of galaxies. The universe is bigger than you can comprehend. You take the earth and it will be yet a grain of sand in the universe or a galaxy. And so some people hear that and immediately want to go into depression mode because it's too big for them to understand. They can't control it. And so they feel small and they want to hide. Some people hear that and relax. The decision on where to eat tonight isn't that big of a deal. I promise you. It is not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things. Getting fired from your job, that sucks. It's terrible. But in the grand scheme of things, the world goes on and you can feel it. Like whenever you get hurt, whether physically or emotionally, the thing that tends to fix it is time. Either the wound will heal or you will forget. And you just move on and you get to kind of deal with the life that's in front of you. And so that time element is this humongous gift. And it gives us hope, actually. When you wake up in the morning, you realize that you got more time here. Whatever happened yesterday was yesterday. And at some point, you're ready to realize and you continue on. And so when I look at the world now, I try to separate it into its layers. And we do this in tech quite a bit. We look at everything at its layers. You see a mobile app, I see the Swift programming language running on a processor built by Apple. And so if you think about society, we have the physical infrastructure, the sun, the moon, the earth, the rivers, the lake, the air, the natural things that just occur. And that is shared infrastructure. Even if people want to draw lines and put up their flags, the earth was here before those ideas were here. And so then we get to this idea tier, right? So we have the reality, the real world as it is, the universe as it is. And then humans create this alternative reality, laws, governments, religion, hate, love, all of these things. We express ourselves, and sometimes they're just stories, and sometimes they're systems. I'm cheering for this team because they live near me, and I want to see the other team lose. Or we have this shared problem that we want to solve, and a lot of the problems are just solving the other problems we created for ourselves. And I try to put all of those things at a layer. So these are human ideas that we convince each other that are worth pursuing and doing. But again, these are just human ideas. And honestly, as important as we want them to be, the king is important. Why? Because we said the king is important. And we all just agree that the king is important and is worthy of praise. But I separate that because I'm like, we just made that up. We made up the fact that there's a king. Maybe it does work. I'm not here to criticize whether the hierarchy works for people or not, but we literally made it up. And so I can turn that off. I can literally choose to ignore it. Doesn't mean that I get to change how the world works, but I can literally choose to ignore that part of the situation and then go back to the fundamentals. What's available? What can I add to that particular set of ideas? Because I got ideas too, and I know how this works. You can actually convince people and inspire people that these ideas are also worth pursuing. And as someone that's been in the tech field, we also have this other tool, software. We can turn these ideas, just like the writer or the poet can turn words into stories. Well, in the software world, we can contribute to this virtual reality we've created called society, and we can digitize it and give people the ability to understand other languages, give people direction so they don't get lost, guide people to making better decisions, etc. And so the thing that makes me hopeful is that I know that this virtual thing that we've all created, these ideas, some of us can actually change them. And when you show people the ability to do that too, that's when they get a little bit of hope too. And you can see it. So when my hope meter starts to drop, just like everyone else, I'll pay attention to the world a little too much. And there's so much that comes in that if you don't have a filter, you will get overwhelmed. And so what I try to do is, hey, I got to turn off the filter, right? We have eyes and ears that can only hear and see for a certain distance, probably for a reason. Because I don't think any human is capable of processing all of that information in real time and then being expected to be able to make adjustments on the fly. So I turn it off. And I remind myself that there is things that you can do within a smaller domain. And so now, I guess, as an educator, as someone who can remind themselves and become hopeful again, sometimes, though, you have to give that ability to others. And the last thing I'll say here is that people reach out to me for mentorship because I guess, to your point, some people will watch those talks and those videos and they might get inspired, maybe not by the technology, but by the story behind the technology. And they asked me, Kelsey, what should I be doing? I want to be like you. I was like, great. It's always great to have a North Star, but I'm kind of unique for a reason. And there are probably parts that if you knew about, you probably wouldn't want no part of. And so, but I say, when it comes to mentoring now, after all of these years, the thing I've learned that I think what a good mentor should do, or at least what I try to do, is I'll listen to a person. And my job as a mentor is to try to make a mirror and hold it up to them and convince them to like what they see. And I think that part where you remind people of how much potential that they have, it does make them feel hopeful. And honestly, when they can see themselves and learn to like what they see, they get what I had, the ability to be authentic as myself and not having to pretend to be someone else.
There's one more question I've got, which I always end with, but just based on what you just said there, was there someone that held up the mirror to you?
I mean, in many ways, I don't know if people intentionally knew how to do that. Because when you think about the care your mother has for you, no matter what's happening, your mom's going to be there. You may not like what comes with that sometimes, but they're always going to be there. But I would say most people have not had enough time to sit down and understand what I just said. That takes a little bit more time of really thinking about it from a philosophical standpoint of what you're trying to achieve. And I do think a lot of those people have contributed to who I am. And I think what I've done is learn how to pay attention to what happens to other people. So you look at their scenarios. There's a quote of, you shouldn't laugh at people when something bad happens to them, because then you'll miss the opportunity to learn from them. And so I would watch people go through these various scenarios. An athlete that has lots of money and they go broke. A music artist signing a bad contract and being tricked out of all their royalties. Or something simple like someone falling down the stairs. All of those things are lessons. And what I try to do is I try to self-reflect through their eyes in that scenario and say, man, what could I learn from that? Is there any adjustment I can actually make? Is there something I should be removing when I see someone behaving badly in public? Maybe if I think I have that particular trait, I should get rid of it quickly. If I see someone doing something that I admire or aspire to, I should do a litmus test to see if that's something that I should add to my own toolbox and just continue growing as a person. So I would probably say, even if no one's done that intentionally because they didn't have the words to describe it the way that I have, but I know that you can actually learn if you're just willing to pay attention.
Absolutely. Okay, final question, which I ask everyone is, we're going to go back in time. If there was one piece of advice that you could offer younger Kelsey, so I'm thinking maybe the Kelsey that was sleeping in his car as he set up his business and chose his business rather than renting an apartment, or any time where you felt a bit lost, what's one piece of advice that you would offer a younger Kelsey?
I would offer the advice is that don't rush through those moments, because that's where the stories come from. No one wants to hear stories from people who've only had a successful life. It just doesn't even sound realistic. There's no character, there's no substance for it. I remember listening to a famous singer's early work, and I was like, it lacked emotion. It lacked experience because the singer was obviously too young to have ever been in a relationship. So I can't hear them sing about love. It doesn't sound right. And there's another singer where their bad relationships, their toxic relationships were public. I'm not advocating that you should be in a toxic relationship, but anyone that has ever been in a toxic relationship, when they sing a song, you can hear it. And so these things shape our characters, how we respond to them. And so the Kelsey that's sleeping in the car, and I do remember talking to myself in that car and saying, I will never be broke again. Like, I don't care what's happening. This is the last time we're doing the broke thing. We're going to figure out how to live below our means. I think I became a minimalist. I tried to make sure that society wasn't dictating my situation. And even though I thought it was a struggle, and it probably was a struggle for sure, but it's where the stories come from. It's where the character's being built. It's like the exercise regimen. If you want to be in shape as a human, those situations, well, that's the exercise. And I think I would have paid attention even more to the details, because in those moments, there's so much to learn, and you only get those opportunities in which to learn them in real time. And so I would give my advice is that this is the part that makes you who you will become.
Kelsey, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I could have talked to you for many hours more, but I won't keep you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.